Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Designing Your Lab for Maximum ROI. This is the second workshop in our three-panel series. I am Jay Brotman, Managing Partner at Svigals Plus Partners. We are a New Haven-based architectural firm that specializes in laboratory design, and we are co-sponsors of this with BioCT. Southern Connecticut and New Haven in particular is one of only a handful of markets showing great success in attracting new startups in the biotechnology sector. And we know that having the facilities to support them is one of the major components in this success. So hopefully we've crafted these discussions to be helpful for startups, incubator graduates, and emerging companies, and to address all the steps from selecting a lab location to designing your facility and moving in. Today we have a stellar collection of lab-ready building owners to discuss the real estate situation in the area with one of our leading brokers, Chris Ostop, moderating this discussion. Chris is a managing director at JLL and leads their Connecticut life science practice with a focus on leasing, laboratory, GMP manufacturing, and office space. Chris brings over 20 years of experience aligning real estate strategies with scientific objectives. Representing both tenants and landlords, Chris partners with entrepreneurs, early stage and global companies throughout the region. Chris?
Hey, thanks, Jay. I appreciate it. And a few housekeeping items as before we get really into it. If you can put your Zoom, I think everybody's muted, and turn your cameras off so we can keep the screen clean. And if you can put your focus on the speaker, if that's an option that's easily in front of you, it'll be a lot easier to follow along. So this one is the second of three panels that we have regarding obviously lab use in the area. And this one is designed around emerging tenants or graduation tenants. And the best way to get into it, I believe, is to give you a scenario that we came up with. And this will lead right into our goals and what we're going to try to accomplish in this panel. If you have questions, please email them in the chat and we'll collect those. And we're not going to answer them as we go, but we'll have a Q&A at the end. We'll make sure we get to as many as we can at the end. But by all means, as you have questions, don't be afraid to type them in. And like I said, we'll get to them at the end. So the goal of this is, as I said, best described with a scenario. And our scenario is this. So it all starts with two scientists in a local incubator. They are researching an experimental therapeutic in immune oncology. Now they see a path for their proof of concept and are getting the attention of many investors. They form a company. They call it Chem Biolabs. We figured that was generic a name. You know, the only thing better than the technology that these scientists are coming up with is the names that they produce when they launch their company. So we figured Chem Biolabs, there's probably no chance anyone's going to use that because it's not crafty enough. But going forward, in order to further their studies, the leadership at Chem Biolabs needs to hire more scientists and staff. Their local incubator is way too small and can't meet their future growth needs. Chem Biolabs needs to find new, larger lab and office space, and they want to stay in New Haven. Where do they begin? This session will walk us through these steps and determine exactly what Chem Biolabs needs. So right now we'll have our panelists introduce themselves, and let's start with Bob.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. I think the first thing for designing a lab for Chem Bio is what we call the first step. There's really three steps. I should first introduce myself. I guess we're supposed to do some introductions here.
Yeah, do introductions first, Bob, okay. And then we'll go into, then I'll get us going into the panel.
Gotcha. So I'm Bob Skolozdra. I'm with Svigals and Partners Architects. I've been with the firm now 33 years. I'm one of the partners and architect and lab planners. Been involved in the biotech industry from way back in the early 90s when it was really getting started. In fact, in our last panel session, the first one, John Soderstrom talked about walking Alexi and Lenny Bell through 25 Science Park. And I remember meeting Lenny Bell at a science park, and we were responsible for helping him get rid of those smells in that building and and make that lab something that he could start to do his science. And you can see the success that he's had over the years with that. So I'm excited to be here to talk about, the steps as it relates to designing your lab.
Thanks, Bob. Rich?
Good morning, Richard Michaud, Corner Properties. My office is in New Haven. We're a property owner where we have a variety of general purpose business and lab configurations, primarily in Brandon.
Great, thank you. Brian?
Good morning. My name is Brian Murray, Managing Director of Strategic Spaces in Connecticut. Strategic Spaces is a furniture company, and we focus on obviously corporate, healthcare, education. But recently, over the past 5 years, we've really been diving into the life science area of the business. Our headquarters is in Boston, and they have been making great success with some of their clients there in the Boston area. And what we're trying to do is take all the knowledge and everything that we've learned and kind of bring it down to Connecticut and really help what's going on in the New Haven market with life science development. So thanks for having me on the panel.
Yeah, you bet, Brian. Glad to have you. Alex.
I'm Alex Twining. I'm CEO of Twining Properties. We have offices in New York and Boston, actually in Kendall Square, and more recently in New Haven. We basically work on urban mixed-use developments across that landscape in the Northeast Corridor. And we first got interested in biotech probably 20 years ago when we began one of our first developments in Cambridge, and bought it from another biotech developer, Lime Properties, who was originally going to be the master developer for Science Park, which is what eventually brought us to Science Park when Lime sold to Biomed, and they were looking to find somebody to flip it to. It was too early for biotech back then, but it's happening now in New Haven. So we're very excited to be back in New Haven, working on both the biotech and also retail and housing in an exciting project. We're relaunching Science Park at Winchester Center. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And last but not least, Carter Winstanley.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Carter Winstanley. I'm a partner with Winstanley Enterprises. We're a Massachusetts-based real estate investment and development company. It's been active in the New Haven area for about 22 years now. Some of our notable projects are 300 George Street, 25 Science Park. Most recently, we built the 100 College Street project for Alexion, and we're currently underway with 101 College, which is coming out of the ground right now, just east of 100 College, and is 500,000 square feet of life science space.
That's good stuff. So when we jump right in here, just to remind each other, so Chem Biolabs is our fictitious company that's coming out of an incubator. And this is near and dear to my heart because New Haven is certainly, this is exactly the type of tenant at the level of life science company that's extremely active in our local market right now. The incubators are, they can typically incubate whether at Yale or in small incubators throughout, whether it's Pierce Labs or out in Groton. But when they graduate from that lab space or believe they graduate, getting some VC money, now they have to grow up quickly and go get their own lab space. So where does a company like Chem Biolabs begin? And Carter, I'll start with you. What makes a true lab space, and when does Chem Biolabs, when do they need true lab space versus traditional office space?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think this is a complicated question, and it's one that we've been debating really for the last 20 years because we've seen a lot of tenants come out and try to squeeze themselves into an office building. They put one hood or one bench, and they basically say that they don't have significant chemicals. They don't have an incredible need for makeup air or ventilation. And I've debated this with Bob and with Svigals over the last 20 plus years about what the right scenario is. for this tenant? Can they really go into an office environment? And, you know, just before the call, we were discussing the merits of NFPA 45 and where does it really draw the line for when you need lab space and when you don't need lab space. And Bob, maybe you want to just talk for a second about where you think the line is, and then we can bat that back and forth about whether that's the right spot to determine.
Right. Well, so like Carter said, there's a lot of places that you go to determine, and a lot of information. That one of the things we do is we try to gather information from our potential lab biotech companies, understand what it is they're doing. And Carter mentioned NFPA 45. NFPA 45 basically says that you can have up to four liters of flammable liquids, or 75 cubic feet of flammable gas, and then you're into a lab 100% circulated environment. Now, can that be done in one hood? I guess technically it can, but there's a lot of other codes that also come into play: the mechanical code, the ventilation code, and so very soon you're going to find that you're going to be very restricted. You start having to measure particulates in your air, and you're very soon going to learn that you're likely going to be faced with some potential hazards. So.
Yeah, so Bob, one of the things we consistently struggle with as tenants go out into the marketplace when they're very young is they try to save on upfront capital costs or rental costs by going into an office building, by requiring the minimum possible air changes, restricting their lab environment to the smallest possible area. And I always question lab operators on why are they doing that. I mean, really what they're trying to do is they're trying to build a company. And in their desire to build a company, I think they've got to remain flexible. I've seen so many companies come into our buildings where they've had dramatic changes or pivots along the way. And suddenly they're doing more chemistry than they ever thought they would. And that's bearing real fruit on the company. And so I think you have to plan for multiple changes in your business plan. And if things go well, you're very likely to expand far more rapidly than you ever dreamed if it goes well. And so you almost have to consider those scenarios as well and say, okay, you saved some money up front, but then when your business pivoted or when it took off, could that building accommodate you? And what are you likely to do with that initial investment? Does that all get thrown out the window as you move to your next facility? Or can it accommodate your growth?
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's what, so, like I started to talk about, what we initially do with companies is we come in and we get them together. We try to, what we do is called programming, where we sit down with the leadership, try to build consensus around a number of issues. You've got this money, your investors, want to see you use it wisely. They want to see you grow. And so we want to build consensus with these companies. Are you planning to outsource your chemistry? Are you planning to do it inside? And all those things, to come up with a program and an understanding of someone's needs so that they can then go to find the right facility. Understanding, what their culture is, what's gonna help them attract employees and retain employees. We know that some people like working in a basement, but not too many people do, and especially the younger generation is looking for sometimes some amenities, and that's what you're going to sometimes need to attract employees. So all those things have to be considered when in developing this program.
Mm-hmm. good. Yeah. So it's clear step one for these companies, and I'll dumb it down being the broker, is step one is determine whether or not this company needs to be in an actual lab. And from what I'm learning here is that being in an actual lab is really not necessarily power or floor loading, but it really boils down to whether or not your science requires ventilation and excessive ventilation and other safety requirements. I know I'm putting it in a tight little box here, but I think let's just determine for this instance that our company, Chem Biolabs, has now determined that their science requires air changes and significant HVAC not found in a typical office or industrial building. So they're going to need lab space. So let me kick it over to Brian. For their future occupancy needs, Chem Biolabs figured out that they need lab space. Where do they start? Which vendors should they call on first? And consultants, where should they go?
Well, thanks, Chris. Now that Chem Bio, they found the building, it's the right place for them. What they immediately need to do is really engage with an architect, an experienced architect who has, obviously experience with life sciences. They need to know that there's a lot of trends out there that, we got to make sure that we, design into the space. As we're seeing now is that flexibility is the key to lab space. In the past, we'd have a lot of fixed components, whether it be casework, and we're moving more and more now toward a modular bench because it's changing, it's moving quicker. I mean, it did take, I think it was pre-pandemic, 8.2 years to develop a drug, and now it's more like a year. So things are just moving quickly. So, again, obviously engaging with the architect is the number one thing. And then, obviously the architect's going to bring in their team who are experienced people who know what to expect and what the clients are going to need, and let them do the guiding of you. At Strategic Spaces, one of our manufacturers is FormaSpace, and FormaSpace has done a great job. They have a tremendous amount of resources that we're able to use to talk to our customers we're in works with the A&D firm because we want to make sure that we understand what their needs are, and that if we need to custom design something, we have the ability to do that. So it really is it's a group effort, but it really, I think, initially starts with the architect, get them moving, they set the game plan, and then we kind of fall into place as we move forward.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. So definitely leading off, you need lab space. Next up, I agree. You definitely need to pick a good architect. And Bob, that brings us right back to you. So what goes into designing? Can you go a little deeper? So now here's Chem Biolabs. They've hired you as a local leader in that industry. So where do they begin, and what goes into designing a new lab space for Chem Biolabs and office space?
Right. Well, assuming we've met with them, we've kind of gone through their programming, met with their leadership, and we've kind of assumed, worked out how much chemistry space they need, how much biology space they need, what kind of office, environments they're looking for. Obviously, weighing, dollars and those kinds of things. Planning for expansion, because we know lab space is harder to expand than it is office space. So we want to make sure that we've planned appropriately for their expansion, where they see they're going to be in the next 5 or 10 years. And we know that their stuff is going to change, so we factor all that stuff in. The next thing is coming up with some layouts, some test fits once we've found a space, doing some test fits so that they can see how they fit in those spaces. Some of the things that we're weighing are, like Brian mentioned, the different laboratory casework options. Do you need, automatic, electric adjustable, shelves or benches, or, can you live with something else? We don't want to spend money on things they don't need. So we want to find the right solutions as it relates to the furniture systems and all the components within the lab, so that they get the best bang for their buck day one. And that's where we start talking to Brian and look at the different options companies like FormaSpace offer, where we can have the right systems for their needs. The third,
perfect. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, once we're finished up with test fitting, you've signed a lease, or you've got a commitment, then we can talk about, actually designing, documenting the space so that it can be competitively bid out in the market and constructed. You've determined that this is the right program, this is the space that's going to meet your needs, and then it's putting together some biddable documents, and that's really the third phase of design before you get into construction. I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Richard, so we know Chem Biolabs wants to remain in Connecticut. Of course they do, right? What local geography should they consider and why?
Well, good morning, Chris. Generally, I find that the tenants choose their location based upon the residence of their senior leadership of the company, in combination with the available real estate. As many folks know, it's tricky these days to find a lab that's suitable for that company's business operations, their design, and in an acceptable location. So lately, it's been New Haven and Brantford, and then some other towns have been branching out into these facilities. But it usually comes down to where is the available real estate within a geographic area, and then can that real estate satisfy my needs? Because the biotech community is a relatively small community, and folks have their all individual and shared experiences, and get tips from others on where's a good place to go and where isn't a good place to go. So there is no easy answer, but the nexus of companies, and biotech companies like to be next to others, has been the New Haven and Brantford areas. But I suspect that that sphere will grow over time as the Connecticut biotech business grows over time as well.
Yeah, for sure. We're all this is clearly one of the exciting sectors in the state of Connecticut, in the sense that there seems to be big growth, and we're all hopeful that the spaces in Brantford are actually leased and the spaces in New Haven are leased. So clearly, we're going to start finding new markets for these companies to grow to. Alex, aside from geography, what other data points should Chem Biolabs consider when selecting a building or even a landlord?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most things any tenant of any size should consider is, especially in life sciences, is how to attract the best minds and the best talents to work in my building. And frankly, whatever the cost of the real estate is, it pales compared to how much they're going to be spending on great employees and retaining those great employees to build their company. And that can't be underscored. And just to take a few examples, so having spent the last 20 years watching Kendall Square grow, and then the last 10 years seeing them try to duplicate it in Seaport Square, those are sort of the two centers of biotech in Cambridge and Boston. What they were looking to do is they want the amenities of places to work and live and eat and dine and shop and all those great things, so that it's an exciting and vibrant environment to be around, which is why in those markets you see so much of that. And even if you take this over to, say, Novartis, who decided in the last 20 years to make Cambridge their world headquarters. Previously, it was in Basel, Switzerland. If anybody's ever visited Novartis's campus in Basel, Switzerland, it's pretty impressive. Basically, they've created their own entire world with their own retail and shopping and offices and all the best architects, et cetera. And now they've realized that they want to open up their campus and connect it to the city. So it's kind of interesting that in the US, obviously, that's the way it's always evolved. And Basel is Novartis is making that choice. In New Haven, we see the same opportunity. And really in New Haven is somewhat duplicating what's happened in New York. There are now growing clusters of activity that are close to two different portions. So I'd say the downtown life sciences cluster is centered around the medical school and the hospital complex, where Carter is building out some phenomenal new buildings. And then meanwhile, there's the Science Hill cluster, which right across a few blocks away from the hill is Science Park, where, of course, Alexion began, Arvinas began, and many of these folks can start. And we're hoping to expand that with our 115 Munson. And we're not just focusing on the lab space, though. We're looking to build retail and housing and open space and programming so that this is an exciting place to come. We don't want you to want to go anywhere else. And that's really the type of thing as a tenant you want to look at. Where do your employees live and how can you keep them happy beyond just the workplace? And so that also means pick a landlord who cares about the tenant, cares about you, cares about your business, realizes that you succeeding is of utter importance, and you'll do whatever you can to make that happen. Thanks.
Yeah, that's all good stuff. Certainly, I think looking at the landlord's capital stack is important as well. Obviously, in evaluating, there's a lot of money that goes into these build outs with converting existing office buildings to lab buildings and building ground up, as Carter's doing. So looking at a landlord's history in doing that, New Haven being greater New Haven and Connecticut being relatively new in this industry. I mean, even though Yale's been around forever and life sciences, the ecosystem of real estate hasn't been around that long. And so we have many local landlords, unlike Boston, unlike DC, unlike Raleigh, Durham, where have national or global institutional landlords. I also think it's super important for these tenants if you're going to marry up with an owner, make sure you understand that the owner has expertise, or at the very least, an avenue to capital to complete the project that you need. It's a little bit different than a traditional office space, to say the least. For the next group of questions, I'm going to have everybody on our panel kind of jump in. This is going to be the secret sauce of what we're trying to deliver here today to give our listeners a good sense of the process of finding new lab space. So Carter, I'm going to lead off with you here on this, but by all means, everybody else, please jump in as you see fit. So Chem Biolabs has developed a business plan with steady growth projections over the next few years. How much space should they take? And let's get into some of the pitfalls and mistakes that companies have made and some of the success stories as well.
That's an incredibly difficult question, given that I have no idea what their space plan looks like. I'd turn to their architect, Bob, and say, what does their preliminary plan look like? If their preliminary plan shows them at 10,000 square feet, it's really going to be a partnership between the tenant and their architect, who are going to establish the space plan and then come out to a series of landlords and look at what the offerings are. And, we can talk about two sides of this. One side is, what does their plan show and how much future growth should they plan for? And how do they do that? And then the other side of it is just looking at within their existing footprint and saying, how many of my people are going to work in a hybrid situation, and for how long are they going to be in hybrid? Is there such thing as hybrid lab space? So I think there are a lot of topics that are tied up in that, and I think we can go in a lot of different directions. But maybe we start first with just the basic raw square footage of 10,000 square feet and say, how much space do you want to go out and try to go for in the market? And that really is going to determine or play off how long a lease are you expected to sign. And so if you're a 10,000 square foot tenant and there's a perfect 10,000 square foot suite in Alex's building, and you can do a shorter term lease because you can't see up over the horizon of 3 to 5 years, that may be a perfect fit, as opposed to if you're building out new space somewhere and the landlord has to finance that cost. That may be a higher bar to get over, and that may require a 10-year lease. And so I think the term of the lease is really going to be an important component to, what kind of space you're taking and how much you can take.
I was just going to jump in here. I think, there's a lot of factors, obviously, to weigh in on. and term. I mean, when we terms of leases and available space, I mean, that's where we're trying to meet with these companies early on. We're trying to determine, you know, what are the kinds of spaces, how much square footage. And we try to understand, you know, like we started having the conversation about chemicals and quantities. We're trying to understand, what is the kind of infrastructure you need? Do you need piped gases, and do you need those kinds of things? Because those things will factor into maybe your cost and the buildings that you start to look at. So, you know, we're meeting with these companies, and we're trying to determine all these things, weigh all these factors. Carter mentioned, you know, work from home. You know, oftentimes, and we're hearing that a lot more now, is that the folks still need to be in their lab. You know, the bench, there's only one place where they can do their bench work, and so that's clearly going to happen at the labs, not in their homes. But what is the balance of office space, and what is the kind of office space that they need? So, you know, can they share spaces? Can they have touchdown spaces? Maybe we can reduce the amount of office square footage and have more lab space. So those are all the things that we try to work out with people early on during that programming stage, so that then they have a nice kind of menu that they can then talk to folks like Carter and Alex and Rich about, you know, what do you have to offer?
I'd add one more thing, which is, I think, obviously, for a new tenant first figuring out their program and exactly how much chemistry and bio and office is a big challenge. And folks like Bob can help a great deal just because they've seen so many go through that. Beyond that, the other thing that's even more difficult for these companies is decide, okay, we've figured it out. We need 10,000 feet to start. How much am I going to need in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? That gets really tough. And I think because it's so difficult, the best thing the tenant can try to do is really evaluate what the options are in the building. How full is that building? What size spaces do they have? How much turnover is there? So that they know whether there's going to be more space for them when they need to grow. And if not, then they really need to look carefully at how can they lock down some expansion. You know, what's the ability to get some future flexibility? Can they get a call on that space, or some kind of right of first offer, or some other structure, so that when space becomes available, if they need it, they can grow. And those are critical, because the other piece that's very difficult is once you've built out a lab space, they're very sticky. They're hard to move. They cost a lot to build. They cost a lot to move. So do it right. And that's why you do want to hire the best consultants to help you plan it correctly so that it can grow and be a smooth transition. Again, to make the lives of your employees as easy as possible so they can focus on inventing new science, not worrying about office space.
And it's difficult because so many of our folks we deal with on a daily basis are constrained by time. You know, they have science, they have investors, they have employees, they want to get working. And finding space that can suit these timelines is very difficult because, you know, building out a biotech lab can take anywhere from 4 to 10 or 12 months, depending upon their unique needs, depending upon the availability of materials. Right now we're in a difficult construction period where it's sometimes hard to get contractors or materials. If I could suggest anything to the folks listening, you know, plan long range and plan early, because there will be unexpected events that will delay you. Very few events will speed up your process. We're generally in a period where things take much longer and cost much more because of this unique COVID environment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, that's all good stuff. So what we're seeing a lot of is obviously these companies coming out looking for their first space are not necessarily going right to 10,000 square feet. They're looking for something smaller, whether it's because their financial backing is limited. Obviously, they want to put all of their venture money into the science, not into real estate. But I think we've all seen, and let's expound on this, we've all seen companies take too little space to start. And what are some of the pitfalls with taking too little space to start?
Well, I can give you some very recent examples where, scientists were sitting shoulder to shoulder at tables. where a room that was designed to have 4 or 5 people in it has 12 people in it, where equipment is stacked on top of equipment, which leads to these HVAC issues that we were talking about earlier, which doesn't really enhance the working environment for these smart people who want to be attracted to these companies and work there in enjoyable environments. So taking too little space breeds these difficulties, but frankly, companies do what they have to do until they find something that's suitable that they can expand into. But plan early and plan something bigger for growth.
Hey, Chris, I don't think you're ever going to get 4 or 5 developers on a call together and have anybody suggest that you should take less space than you originally thought. I mean, we're always going to say you should definitely take more space. So I'm in agreement with that. It is interesting to look at, some of the tenants that we've worked with over the years. I've heard the same story again and again, and that is 2 years from now, they're either looking at it as a binary decision where they're either out of business or they're 3 to 5 times the size they thought they were. And so it's an incredibly hard model to plan for, because either the science works or something gets approved or the proof of concept works and it takes off and it's growth by a series of multiples, or their science didn't take off and the idea didn't make sense or didn't work, and it ends up going in a totally different direction or going out of business. And there is a very high failure rate. And I think to Alex's point, trying to find a home in a building with a dynamic environment with a lot of space opportunities is extremely valuable. It's a big part of the reason why we build very large buildings, is so that we can have a diversity of tenant group within the building. There's always somebody who's expanding like crazy and somebody who's going out of business. And it's that diversity of tenant group that allows for different growth opportunities to occur within the building. And I think there's real value to that.
Yeah, I completely agree. The ecosystem definitely works. Tenants growing, tenants shrinking, just to have the opportunity to find expansion space inside your current building is goes without saying. Obviously, very cost savings as opposed to going and having to move 2 years into maybe a 5-year lease because you outgrew the space. Bob, is there tricks to designing for expansion in lab and office users, for the lab portion or the office portion?
Yeah, well, there's definitely flexible systems, flexible ways to design a lab so that it can be easily expanded. We want to pay attention to sizing things appropriately. There's the air systems and the shafts for exhaust, for instance, if we're going into a building and converting it from office. We want to put those things in once and at the right size, and so we want to make sure we've got that infrastructure appropriately designed, or if it's an existing building that has the space, then that's the good news. And then it's looking at systems. Brian has a lot of systems that their company offers that we can look at modular ways to design a lab so that you can move that wall from bay 1 to bay 2 if another company comes in. So if we design them very flexible, very modular, any company can kind of come in and see themselves fitting into that space with some minor manipulations. So that modularity certainly helps with flexibility.
Yeah, Bob, you're right. I mean, you take about pre-pandemic, most labs are dedicated to one form of research for long periods of time. Today, post-pandemic, you're looking at, these labs being retasked many times in a short period of time. So the type of furniture that can help you provide that type is important, and that's the modular benches that are out there today. But the other thing that is interesting, I think, Rich, you kind of brought it up, is, ergonomics. You're talking about these researchers working on top of each other. And, what we're seeing is a lot of companies really taking this, and these are researchers, they're smart people, they're well-educated, and they need a good place to work, and they need to work in a place where they can also work effectively and efficiently, and they want to keep good health. And so you're seeing a lot of the furniture that's now being introduced is addressing some of the ergonomic needs that in the past, these researchers were being crammed into a space that, necessarily wasn't made for that type of research. So it looks like it's ergonomics and flexibility are the trends that are kind of being pushed upon right now, moving forward, post-pandemic.
I just add the one other thing on the pandemic is, and again, I think nobody really knows the answer to these things, but it's kind of the rumor mill amongst a number of the biotech firms is that clearly during COVID, they still had to, as everybody said, they have to have their people in the lab doing their primary research, but the vast majority of their pure office people were able to work from home. So now, just reacting to the COVID situation, a number of them are starting to think, well, could we exist with less office space, but actually grow our lab space per person slightly to give them a little more room to operate in. And again, I think it's very hard to plan based on COVID, but we should keep in mind that those trends may adjust things somewhat. And Brian and others may have already seen this happening. I don't know.
Hey, Chris, I think it's an interesting topic as you look at expanding the lab or having more of the office environment working from home. What we're not talking about is the base building infrastructure that supports a move like that. What you just described, Alex, is that you could have a lab that's 60% lab space and 40% office, make an adjustment where all of a sudden it's 80% lab and 20% office. And that seems like an easy topical design issue where you just pull out office space and move benches and hoods in. But there's huge infrastructure implications associated with that. And the first thing every tenant's got to do is they have to evaluate what the base building standard is, what the landlord delivers for a base building specification. Does the engine in the building that runs the air and exhaust and the power, and it's really CFM per square foot and watts per square foot, do those two things accommodate a move where you shift from a 60-40 lab to office to an 80-20? Because that may seem like a great move that gives you lots of flexibility, but if you're buying all new air handlers, boilers, chillers, and upgrading the power for a building where you have a 5-year lease, there's no economic sense to that. It's part of why you want to make sure you're choosing a building by evaluating the landlord specification up front. You want to look at that. You don't buy a car without understanding what the engine is. And you can shop from one car to the next and compare on an apples to apples basis what the engine is. You want to do the same thing with landlords and the buildings.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Alex.
No, I just think that's the exact issue. And I think some of these trends that, more office, less, may not be taking into full guidance how much of that office is for the lab folks and how much isn't. So I think it's a complicated question. But I do think that the point Carter's making is really a different one, which is make sure the bones of the building, the guts, the plumbing function for your need. Because if they don't, you're going to pay a lot more in your tenant improvement dollars. And that cannot be underscored. Again, why you need good consultants, MEP consultants who can analyze the shaft space and the airflow, et cetera, because that's not stuff that most people know how to do. And if you do that wrong, you're going to be in trouble economically.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there because, we talk a lot about the air and, that seems like the obvious thing for a lab. But, Carter and Alex, you both pointed out, the electrical is important too. You got to have a building that has the electrical service and has the capacity. It's a lot higher in a lab, obviously. Same thing with the plumbing, Alex, you just touched on it. Do you have the appropriate waste system that you need for laboratories? So those are all things that are important to, infrastructure things that need to be considered.
And I don't want to beat this point to death, but this really, from my standpoint, I think this is the critical feature to trying to figure out where your lab space should be. Once you've determined what the base building specifications are, I think you also want to look at the flexibility of the building, and you want to look hard at the landlord. Because what we just talked about is a tenant who shifts from a 60-40 lab to office to an 80-20. And that building may be able to accommodate it. But when you're operating next to a tenant that makes a shift, a couple things are going to happen. One, if the landlord comes in and is not ready for it, they're going to start doing a series of shutdowns to bring new power in, new boilers, new chillers, new air handlers. And they're going to be scheduling times with you where they're going to shut your lab down. And you can't be shut down. If you've got a series of experiments that are running and you're venture backed and you got one shot through this to prove your concept, you can't have your landlord come to you and say, by the way, your neighbor's expanding and we'd like to shut your lab down for 2 days. That doesn't work. And so choosing the landlord and understanding that base building specification is critical. You need a partner as a landlord, somebody who understands what your business is and understands how to keep you up and running at all times. And so I think that base building specification is critical. And I think evaluating the landlord is critical because they're your partner.
Yeah, that's a terrific point, Carter, for sure. Is there a way to, in your initial move, so let's go back to your initial scenario where it's 10,000 square feet, let's call it 60-40. Now you're 60-40 lab heavy, 60% lab, 40% office. And just so that our listeners know that building out office space is likely 1/3 or 25% of the cost of what it's going to build out lab space. So is there a way, knowing that you're going to be in 10,000 square feet for, call it 7 or 10 years, is there a way to pre-build that infrastructure to accommodate lab growth? Because that's going to be the most needed thing, right? Expanding office space is easy. You can do that anywhere, and if need be, you can do it across the street. But moving your lab is obviously super expensive. Is there a way to put the initial infrastructure in the lab to accommodate doubling in size? And would you recommend doing that? Or do you add that, as long as you have the shaft space, do you add that as you need it? Or do you make that investment up front?
Generally, it's a case-by-case decision, but when you have the opportunity, I've been building it out early. And what does that generally mean? I mean, it very much means HVAC, as so much of what we're talking about is HVAC. Lab quality HVAC units can also run an office, but you can't do it in the reverse. So if the landlord is willing to invest early on and put lab quality HVAC in the building, even though it might be serving some office, that certainly makes a big difference. And that's something that we've been doing quite a bit lately, specifically as it relates to dehumidification, CFMs and things of that nature, because those pieces of equipment can be adjusted down to office, but as we say, you cannot do the reverse. And doing the reverse, changing office to lab, is very time consuming in that, these lab quality units could take you 6, 8, 9 months just to get, even after you've ordered them. There's a whole timing apart from design component that can certainly delay a company's desire to adjust their footprint.
Chris, one thing that's interesting is every time a tenant shows up to look at our building, I see the same sequence. We come in, we want to show space, and the tenants immediately want to go upstairs and they walk right to the window and they look at the views and they think about where their office is going to be and what they're going to be staring at every day out the window. And I have yet to have a tenant, and I'm looking forward to the first day it happens, but I've yet to have a tenant come in and say, take me to your boiler room, or take me to your air handle, take me to the penthouse and show me your mechanicals. It's never happened. And yet that's where you're going to spend all your money. And I think it's interesting when you go into a really good lab facility, what you should see is that the lab infrastructure is built in a modular fashion where the landlord can add components in a modular way. And part of that speaks to the ability not to take the building down on other tenants. But the other half has to do with, can you add air supply? Can you add exhaust? Can you add the boilers, the chillers, the power, the cooling towers, any of the things that go along with that? Can you purchase that on an incremental basis or in a modular fashion? So if your business changes, you can add incrementally, or more importantly, the landlord can do it for you. When you go down into our chiller room in the basement, what you're going to see is a lot of wet taps up in the piping with pads already poured in place in the basement floor. So if we exceed our chiller capacity because you have added a whole bunch of -80 freezers, we have the ability to roll chillers in, put them in place. The wet tap's already there. Nobody gets taken down, and the infrastructure cost to upgrade is really kept to a minimum. And so that flexibility, that modularity of the base building work is really crucial. And, I look forward to that first tenant coming in the door and saying, let's go down to the basement. I want to take a good look at what's in your chiller plant.
Never happened.
Not yet.
It's never happened. They're very interested in backup power. They love seeing generators. So that's certainly because they think about their -80 freezers, and that's really quite important to them. And the buzzwords lately is 100% fresh air with COVID and all that. But no one's ever asked me to see a boiler either.
Yeah. Take me to your air handlers.
What a beautiful shaft space you got.
Yes.
Good. How about the difference between Chem and biolab space? I know it's hard to really discern, but which of those, if a tenant is Chem heavy versus bio heavy, is there a difference in infrastructure? And what are those differences?
I'll jump in here first. Clearly, typically chemists need more bench space and they need more hood space. And so one of the things we do during programming is we kind of sit down with them and, they're going to ask for, I need 2 6-foot hoods and I need 12 feet of bench and per chemist. And, so we'll let them see what that means and what that looks like from a space standpoint and from an HVAC standpoint. And that's why we like to get everyone in the room. We get the biologists in the room, they say, and the chemists in the room, and everyone looks at the space. The biologist says, well, I can get by with 6 feet of bench for biologists, and I only need 1 hood for every 10 biologists. And so we kind of look at all these things, and during programming, kind of weigh them out. Everyone sees what they're asking for, and the company, then it helps the company that makes the decisions on, do we outsource our chemistry? How much do we need to keep in-house? This is the space it's going to take. This is the infrastructure it's going to take. Clearly more hoods means more air, means bigger HVAC, takes up space. So the chemistry space is usually at least twice the size of the space for a biology space, and sometimes it's 3 times as much space.
Are there any
Chemistry?
infrastructure differences? Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, tremendous infrastructure differences, because generally the difference is bio hoods versus vented fume hoods. Vented fume hoods need exhaust, they need makeup air, so it all has to do with HVAC again, where bio hoods generally can do with less HVAC infrastructure because they don't have the makeup air or supply considerations that vented fume hoods do. And it's also much cheaper to, wheel a bio hood into a room and plug it into the wall versus the infrastructure that's required for all the fume hoods. So there's a significant cost difference and timing difference for building out chemistry space versus general biospace.
I think you can get deep down into the weeds of this issue, Chris. It's amazing over the last 20 years looking at the design of what the airflow or air changes per hour are in a serious chem environment. And that's changed substantially. I mean, it was low when I first got in the business. My father was actually a chemist when he started his career, and he talks about working in chemistry environments where they didn't have any air changes. So it started very low. It ramped up, 20 some years ago, it ramped up very high on the number of air changes per hour. And now between night setbacks and occupancy sensors, and just challenging what the chemical uses are in the space and how many air changes you really need, and talking about the efficiency or lack thereof of lab spaces. If you look at the utility costs, people are scaling way back on the number of air changes. Every time you turn that air over and you exhaust it out the top of the building and you replace it with new air, it doesn't seem like a big challenge on a beautiful 72-degree day like today. But don't forget, in a couple months, it's going to be 2 degrees in the morning. And every time you dump that air out the top of the building, you're replacing it with 2-degree air. And so there's enormous inefficiency associated with that. And so I would want to start that discussion with, what are the chemicals you're using? What type of hoods, occupancy sensors, motion sensors, night setback? What are the controls that you're putting on these hoods? And I think you want to work very closely with a very talented mechanical engineer to challenge all of those assumptions to manage the efficiency of that system.
I'd like to jump in here because Carter hit on it, is what are the chemicals you're using? One of the things that we like to do during programming, one of the first things that we do is we ask for an inventory of everything that you're using, because we want to right size the mechanical systems. And we'll work with the clients to obtain those chemical inventories and look at what is the safe way, what things really need to be done in a hood, what things don't need to be done in a hood. And like Carter mentioned, the air changes and all those factors are really important. Do you need to do that in a walk-in hood that's 12 feet big? Can it be done in a smaller hood based on what you're working with and what your protocols are? So that's stuff that it's important to get that stuff and understand what it is, so that we can right size things and it can work appropriately and safely.
Very good, thank you. So we touched on this briefly and I like to hit it on it again, a little more detail. Maybe, Bob, this is something you can start with. So pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, what changes, and Brian as well, what changes can we see in occupancy levels? So just to educate people who may be listening, in a traditional office space, we'll see a range of 200 square feet to maybe 250, maximum 250 square feet per employee. What's the typical ratio in a life science company for employee per square feet? And then how does that, and clearly because some people are going back and forth to the lab, so I'm assuming they're going to take some more square footage there. And how has that changed, or how are you seeing that change because of COVID? And do we expect those changes to stay long term?
Well, I mean, I'll just jump in here briefly. I don't have a lot of metrics at my fingertips, but I'm typically seeing about 350 square feet, you know, for a kind of a typical, you know, call it 7,000 square foot tenant. You know, I'm kind of seeing it somewhere in that range, 20 people kind of into it, which is like 350 square feet. You know, the lab, like we talked about, the lab space, they're going to need the lab space, and they're working there, you know, pandemic or no pandemic, they need to be in the labs. And those are the folks that got back in the labs very quickly. Actually, most of them didn't leave the labs. They needed to be in the labs. They spread out a little bit more. They, you know, they did some shifts when we were at the height of it. And they're trying to get away from their office space, their touchdown, but they all say that they need a place to go to touch down and that's outside of the lab. Some of them can do it at home, but there are times when they need to kind of go back and forth. So, but we're looking at flexible ways of designing that office space when it's when they're in between doing their experiments.
And I see as it relates to the office side of it, it's almost as if, you know, yes, there are some companies out there who are giving back space, but the majority of them, these smaller, mid-sized companies, they're just utilizing their space differently. It's not one workstation for everybody. It's you know, might be training rooms, community areas, just different places where they can come in, they can touch down, they can have a conversation, meet their colleagues. But again, it's just changing the space versus giving it all back.
Right. Are we seeing a 1-for-1, meaning one seat for every employee, for every scientist in the life science industry? Or are they sharing as they're doing in other corporate models?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing people go to sharing what that number is. Is it a 25 or 50% reduction? We're probably, it's not 50% right now, but it's you know, it's I think that's where everyone's trying to figure out is what is the right number.
One of the other questions I have on the lab is lab versus things that can be done quantitatively. I know up in the Boston marketplace, we're working on a project with Longfellow and Biomed, and their projections were that a higher percent of the lab work is done on the computer, and so there's a reduction in the amount of lab space taken. But I haven't seen that bear out too much, and I'm just curious in New Haven, Carter, others, whether you're seeing that or not. Maybe it's for the larger tenants, not.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it with the companies that we're talking to.
Yeah, so I think we definitely have seen it. We've seen more of the companies trending toward doing modeling and statistical modeling in a lot of their drug work and running parallel systems. And they're doing that in an effort to speed up everything from trials to investigations. And so people are doing more of that. We refer to that as more of the dry lab space. And we found that dry lab space, or the data-driven lab space, is still not stuff that people are doing at home. You know, that's stuff that they are building a dry lab. It's more like a biology lab. You know, the question then becomes, do you need makeup air for it? You probably don't need makeup air for it. But what you do have to have is you probably have a fair amount it becomes a load-driven space because you're generating a lot of heat in that space because of the computing power. And so you end up having specialty cooling associated with it, with more of the computational modeling. So it's a different type of space. It's got different mechanical needs, but you're still not doing that from home. That's not contributing to the flex type environment.
And it's not cheap either. I mean, it's more like building your data center effectively.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, no, we saw, seen companies actually have to, during pandemic, that heavy computing infrastructure, they had to create, data centers so that they could do that work at home, and that created space and heat, issues with creating those data centers, so that the 3D modeling that they're doing on the chemistry side could be done remotely. And there's those folks still need to get together. They need to view things, as a group. So there's still that collaboration that needs to happen. So those collaborative spaces and the ability to model, but then also view those models and work together on manipulations that does take up space.
To be clear, all of the computational stuff is done in the cloud now, where you're buying time on the computer systems, whether it's Google's system or Amazon or somebody else. But the head end, where people are sitting down and reviewing that, manipulating the models, looking at outcomes, that for the most part is done together in a collaborative environment in the office. I think that's hard, that's way out beyond my expertise. But that feels like difficult work to do in an isolated environment at home.
And I think we're finding, as we come out of COVID, companies want to get back in the office. We talked about Novartis up in Cambridge, Mass. My brother works at Novartis in Cambridge, Mass. He's been home for a month and a half. But there's only so much you can do at home, and I guess they're bringing their people back this coming Monday. So things are changing as we come out of COVID, and people's mindsets look more to the future instead of worrying about COVID in the past.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in the corporate worlds, it's all the same. I mean, corporations, even though they may have a robust work from home or flexible workspace now, the leadership typically wants their employees to come back in, and their employees are reluctant in some instances. So employers are looking for vibrant workspaces to encourage. So the office space is something fun, or the workspace is a fun, vibrant place to go through. And I think that we touched on a lot of that with the ecosystem, being the benefits of being in a cluster with other life science companies. We're seeing lab users putting their labs on the bright side with the big windows. Obviously, they want their scientists to be in the lab. They don't want the lab to be buried in the basement or buried on the interior. They want it to be a bright place where people are encouraged to go. So I think the lab users are looking for the same type of building amenities and vibrant workspace as any office user is, and that is, common food areas, fitness centers, rooftop gardens, just interesting places that are make it a fun place to go to work, as opposed to a dreary basement office space that perhaps was a pre-pandemic more accustomed to. As we're getting ready to wrap up, let's help these life science companies. Let's help Chem Biolabs as they're getting into a lease. What lease points in the document should they be focused on? And can we get into term length and TI and rights of first refusal and expansion, perhaps even termination? But what are some critical lease exponents that they should be looking for in their document to give them the most amount of protection for whether it be growth or expansion or even downsizing? Alex, I'll ask you to start.
Okay.
Funny how everybody's quiet now all of a sudden.
Right.
Actually, I'd probably start with the point Carter made, which is first figure out what the base building has and what's captured in that and how that's documented. And then look at how your actual tenant improvement allowance is structured so that you understand exactly where that bright line is between what the landlord's doing and you're doing, and make sure that the lease terms reflect that correctly and have enough detail to back it up so that you know you have documents that get you that fit out. That's probably, and obviously we talked a lot about lease term. I think that's obviously another critical one, and having flexible lease terms ability if you can, depends on where the landlord is on his leasing, expand, contract, rights to different things. Those are probably some of the key. Obviously, all the financial terms I don't think we have to mention, but obviously you're going to look closely at rent and term, but how many months free, etc.
Well, I find that life science folks are very much led by their attorneys when it comes to this process, because they're very good at science, but they're really not so much interested in the building stuff. But having said that, and touching upon what everyone's been saying earlier, your lease is going to be a reflection of the relationship you have with the landlord or the other professionals. It can never replace that. And there will always be problems. There will always be growth issues. There will always be changes. And if you're working with folks who are interested in your business just as much as their business, and helping you achieve your goals so that you can both grow together, that's probably the most important thing that you can find in stepping into a lease or stepping into a building, because there will be changes. And it's very much a working partnership, I find, with biotech companies far more than other companies that just don't need the same type of interaction with the building professionals.
Chris, I'd say I look at it from the tenant perspective, and the most advantageous deal you can negotiate is a 1-year deal with 10 one-year options to extend, options to expand, rights of refusal, and the maximum TI allowance. That's your most advantageous deal. But you're not going to get that because you probably have no credit at the time. And you're looking at a high investment by the landlord that's got to be managed and offset by some term to get some reinvestment or some return on the investment there. And so if you're not going to get a 1-year deal with all those options and maximum funding, you're really trying to balance that against the fact that you don't have credit and you're going to have to give some term to allow for reinvestment. And it's finding a landlord that will work with you on each of those items. And that's hard to do. That's why it's a challenging marketplace. And in the past, that's why there have always been fewer life science landlords than office and industrial landlords. That's changing, and it's fantastic that there's a bunch of landlords in town now that give a bunch of different options to tenants. So I would say go shop your options and make sure you understand what you're getting.
And good advice. Does anyone else have anything to add? If not, I'll take a couple of questions here that folks have wrote in from the outside viewers. Here's an interesting one. A question is asking if we're seeing tech companies or life science companies more willing to share building common amenities, whether it's meeting space, collaborative space, cafeterias, et cetera, rather than building their own. Are they willing to share, or does the proprietary nature of the work, competition, confidentiality outweigh the savings that they could get from sharing those office spaces?
So Carter was going to answer this.
Look,
Alex.
look, I'm always happy to jump in. I think there's a lot of different amenities that we're talking about. In 101 College, we're building a 450-seat conference facility that can be broken up into multiple rooms. You know, there's smaller conference rooms, there's kitchens, there's all different amenities. And I think more and more people are willing to share. I think they're certainly willing to share when they're smaller and in the upstart phase. And then you see as tenants grow larger and larger, they really want to control those amenities in-house. So it depends where you are in the life cycle. Ideally, this is why you have a professionally run incubator space. You know, so we're working with BioLabs on 101 College. They're going to do a 50,000 square foot shared lab environment or a co-working space. And it's exactly what we just talked about. You know, they will have shared conference rooms, meeting rooms, kitchens, training areas, equipment, all of that, specifically to design for the shared environment. But again, it depends where you are in that life cycle.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. We're seeing definitely in the smaller, newer companies who are willing to share just for the cost savings of it, and perhaps they're going to do they really need the lab space, right? So that's something they can't share or unwilling to share. But when they leave the lab and what they would do with a more mature company would be go across the hall and go sit in their office space and start analyzing with their findings. We're seeing those smaller, newer companies willing to do their what we call head down work, right? So when you're at your computer, at your desk, at your laptop, writing your reports or analyzing your findings, you're more flexible in where you're willing to do that. So we're certainly seeing some folks perhaps willing to share a kitchen, an entryway, an office or two, a conference room, but they definitely want to have their own lab within their own behind their own lock and key, and perhaps their own private workspace behind their own lock and key. But as far as sharing cafeterias or common meeting space, for sure, I think that goes across any type of corporate user. How about another question came in? What's a typical timeline? I know this is going to be a broad base, but so like we started off, Chem BioLabs is getting their VC money, and they're about to hit the ground running, and they need to grow and need to go find 10,000 square feet. From the time they receive the commitment letter from their backers, how long before they're up and running in their new space?
Depends widely. Depends on what the different scenarios are that are available. I mean, if we have some company that's just moved out of 10,000 square feet and is upsized into 22 floors up and is leaving behind a perfect 10,000 square foot space, you could have somebody move in a matter of months or even quicker. If they're taking raw space in a building and adding infrastructure, and they need to take it from ground up design through construction, it could take a year.
Yeah, and on the design side of things, a small 10,000 square foot company, we could probably understand their needs in one or two meetings on a kind of a really, programming, high level. We could probably understand that. So, within a few weeks, we could have a pretty good sense of what their space needs are. And then it's, is the building that they're going into, is it ready? How much, renovations need to take place? Like Carter mentioned, it could be, weeks to a month maybe to turn around a quick renovation. If it's more major renovations, might take 2-3 months to come up with the appropriate design and figure out the infrastructure that's needed for their space. So it does vary.
Yeah, for sure. I think from our experience, clearly there's a set group of variables in there: the design process, the selection process. They can be squeezed as time permits, or as people are able to meet. We can squeeze programming with you, Bob, into 2 weeks perhaps, and going out and evaluating the market based on those parameters that you decided. That's 10,000 square feet, 60% lab, and this is the infrastructure we're looking for. Now it's part of going out and seeing if there's something existing. Really, the wide range of the big variable there is if you can find it. And that's the issue today, is that right now, given the amount of these graduation tenants, these pre-emerging tenants who are coming out, there's not a lot of options for them. So they're going to have to go find something, find a landlord, find a building that is pre-lab ready. And that's where it probably takes another 5 months of construction, physical construction, of doing engineering drawings. That includes design and getting in mechanical engineering and plumbing drawings, and then actual construction before that tenant can move in. So if you're lucky enough to find existing space, it could be as short as probably 90 days. And that's probably on the short end. And as long as 5 months, if you're in an existing building, lab building that doesn't have perhaps a lab space for you, as long as Carter said, probably a year for minimally for ground up. Let's see what other questions we have here. Is there any benefit to being in a single-story building versus a multi-story building from a construction or from an occupancy standpoint?
Absolutely.
Yeah, what are some of those differences?
I'm going to just go out on a limb and say I've got all multi-story buildings, and it is definitely simpler to be in a single-story building.
Yeah.
The Brantford market has been incredibly successful, in part because there's a lot of single-story product out there, and part of the reason for it being easier is you've got much quicker and simpler access to the roof. And you can square up your exhaust, your supply air, mechanical equipment right there on the roof. Now, as a multi-story landlord, I would say we have different advantages in trying to build a cluster of tenants. But our goal is to make your occupancy in the building as simple as if you were in a single-story building. So our job is to deliver the lab services to the core, so it feels like you're in a single-story building. You're going to duct your exhaust right into the core, and there's a home run to the roof with a house fan. You're going to tap into the core for your lab air. So it's going to feel just like a single-story building, but it definitely is easier from a landlord standpoint. I mean, I'd love to have all single-story buildings, easier to work with.
And thanks for that, Carter. Last question. I know we're getting to the top of the hour here. So last question perhaps for our developers. Are landlords building out the lease space, or are they allowing the tenants to pick out and use their own contractors to do the construction? Richard, let's start with you.
So there are very few biotech companies who are who have the infrastructure, who have the expertise, and even the desire to build out their space. Certainly, there are some of them, and they're somewhat unique. But generally, I find that the vast majority of the biotech companies want the landlord to build it out for them and almost deliver like a new car experience. The tenant knows what the base model price is, but then there's a long discussion about the options, and they just want to wait for delivery. And that's perfectly fine. And I think most landlords can do that. But there are some tenants who have their own in-house real estate team. But that's few and far between. And definitely not the case for these emerging companies, which really need a lot of assistance from, from all types of qualified professionals.
And I'd echo the same. And frankly, maybe there are three tranches. There are the real small guys who don't have any real estate expertise, and they're going to need consultants and third-party contractors from the landlord, et cetera. There's the kind of mid-size who maybe hire a real estate consultant to guide them down the process, and even a real estate development consultant. That's kind of mid-level. And then obviously the very big tenants may have their in-house folks to actually orchestrate construction. But I would say most tenants stray away from that. But we found it all depends on the tenant size. And if the tenant is very large and has a strong capability, then we're fine to go that route if that makes sense to both of us.
Carter, how about in your buildings? Are you allowing tenants to build out their own space, or are you handling all the construction?
We absolutely allow tenants to build out their own space. It really is an allocation of time and what and where they want to spend their time. And we have 25 people in our construction group and our pre-construction group, and they're sitting in 300 George Street waiting to service tenants that we're working with on a daily basis. You know, when you come into our buildings, you're welcome to bring your own crew in and your own design group and run your own job. We'd be happy to do that, but we also put our team out there and make them available because frankly, we think or have found that you want to focus on your science, not on, sheetrock and concrete.
Yeah, for sure. Well, listen, we're at the top of the hour, so I wanted to thank our panelists for taking the time, and I thought this was extremely informative, and hopefully the viewers found it equally as helpful as emerging and graduation space tenants get out in the market. We're seeing a lot of them right now, so hopefully this will help them navigate that process. And I don't have the date, but there's a third panel that's coming up that's going to be equally as good. It's actually with more of the end users from the biotechs. Jay Brotman from Svigals is going to host it along with Sean Cassidy from Arvinis, Scott Phillips from Halda, Alyssa Waterman from Freethink Technologies, Jan Bertonis from Zetra. Cheryl, are you able to give me that date?
Yeah, it's 2 weeks from today, October 26th.
Perfect. And I think that'll be super helpful. That is actually, like I said, the end users, the physical biolabs themselves, the companies themselves and their leadership. And they're going to walk through what they found and some of the tips and tricks and pitfalls and how to overcome that during the next one in 2 weeks. Well, thank you all very much. Cheryl, I'll turn it to you to sign off.
Thank you to everybody for joining. We are going to be sending out a recording of this session in the next couple of days. And we encourage you to go to Eventbrite and sign up for the third session. And we thank you so much. Thanks, Chris.
You bet. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you, panelists.